Did you know Pikmin was not inspired by Shigeru Miyamoto's garden? Every Nintendo fan has heard the origin story of Pikmin, where Miyamoto was inspired by watching ants in his garden. However, in a 2011 interview on Japanese TV, Miyamoto admitted that wasn't actually true. The ant story was just a marketing gimmick, a simple way of explaining the concept of a completely new type of game. In reality, the creation process was much more complicated. For the first year of Pikmin's development, the game didn't include Pikmin or any creatures resembling ants at all. Instead, it starred two primitive life forms called Adam and Eve, who had a ball for a body, 2 eyes, and a nose. Miyamoto stated, "At the beginning, the idea was just to look at their life. I thought it was an interesting idea. Watch their life was the theme. Give them love or make them fight. Act like God. Depending on the decisions, they could make a nest and have children." Players would watch on as Adam and Eve protected their village from dinosaurs and woolly mammoths. If successful, they'd breed and expand their village. Footage of that early prototype was never made public, but based on the developer's description, it sounds like a prehistoric version of SimCity on a smaller, more intimate scale. The developers eventually broadened the game to focus on 10 or 20 life forms instead of just 2, but Miyamoto still had the Mario 128 tech demo floating around in his imagination, so he ordered for there to be over 100 creatures. The scale grew and grew until the prototype was made up of several villages, with the player wanting as many villagers to survive as possible. But if some died in the struggle, the game would continue. A player character, who later became Olimar, was added as a more interesting way of having a cursor. The creatures who ultimately became the Pikmin were first introduced as weapons the villager used as projectiles. At this point in development, the game wasn't set in a microscopic world. According to Miyamoto, the villagers were comparable to primitive man, and the Pikmin weapons were as big as cats. Eventually, the developers went to Miyamoto's neighborhood to snap photos of forests and caves to use for the game's background, and it was at that point someone suggested they make the villagers behave more like ants. The idea was greenlit, and the game was set on a new trajectory. Eventually, the Pikmin creatures supplanted the villagers, and the project evolved into the game we know today. This is where Miyamoto came up with the fake story about his eureka moment watching ants in his garden. Years later, Miyamoto also admitted he drew some inspiration from Mule, a 1983 Atari game where players used dozens of robotic mules to extract resources from an alien planet. Mule even had mountain wampus players could hunt for extra resources, similar to how iridescent flint beetles in Pikmin reward players with pellets and nectar. At some point in development, Adam and Eve's names were changed to Piki, the Japanese measure word for animals. For example, Japanese people might say, "I have 2 Piki cats," or 3 Piki dogs. When the plant creatures replaced the villagers, they took the name Piki for themselves, but Nintendo ran into complications with the trademark, so they ended up changing the name to Pikmin. There were quite a few changes late in the game's development. Pre-release footage shows Olimar using his whistle to pluck Pikmin out of the ground. But Miyamoto thought the mechanic made harvesting too quick and easy, so he removed it 2 months before the game was finished. However, the whistle pluck feature is still hidden in the game's internal data, and you can even unlock it in the final game using cheat codes. And despite Miyamoto's reservations, the mechanic did eventually make its way into Pikmin 2 as the Pluckaphone. The world originally featured a lot more puzzles, but Miyamoto felt they made Pikmin feel too much like a game rather than a living, breathing world, so he ended up removing a lot of them as well. Multiplayer was originally planned, with Shigeru telling Nintendo Power the original idea was based on Red Pikmin versus Blue Pikmin. A few unfinished 2-player stages can even be found in the game's data. References to a multiplayer option for the main campaign are also hidden in the data, but the mode was never finished. According to Miyamoto, there was another mode that didn't make the cut. In the release version, if the player fails to collect at least 25 ship parts within the 30-day time limit, you get the game's bad ending. With Olimar's oxygen supply down to 0, he's forced to launch his unfinished rocket into space, but takeoff fails and the rocket plummets back down to the Pikmin planet. The bad ending was once meant to trigger a new mode featuring Olimar's ghost, where the player was forced to relive Olimar's memories. Originally, there was going to be more emphasis on replayability, with fans expected to play Pikmin from start to finish several times to experience all 3 endings. But ultimately, Olimar's ghost mode never got made. Instead, it was replaced with a cutscene showing the Pikmin rescuing Olimar from his crashed ship and turning him into a Pikmin. After the game launched in 2001, Miyamoto challenged his team to ride the wave of momentum and develop Pikmin 2 in just a single year. But development ended up taking almost 3 years. The massive delay was partly due to staff being temporarily shifted over to Wind Waker, which was already experiencing delays of its own. But the main reason Pikmin 2 took as long as it did came down to quality control. When Miyamoto stopped by mid-development to see what the developers had made so far, he thought the project was way too similar to Pikmin 1. He was so dissatisfied with the game's quality that he ordered the team to change direction, which had a significant impact on the release date. Just like the first game, the Pikmin team spent some time tinkering with a multiplayer campaign in the sequel, but once again ended up scrapping it. The game's director, Shigefumi Hino, explained why in a 2004 interview, saying, "We did experiment with two-player gameplay in the campaign, but we came to the conclusion that designing the entire single-player game around the possibility of a second player joining in would put limits on what we could do with the campaign. Ultimately, we decided to implement multiplayer separately by creating verses and cooperative maps. When Pikmin 2 was released around the world, a few dozen treasures were changed in different regions. For example, in Japan, the time capsule had a picture of a cat inside, and the arboreal frippery was changed to a red maple leaf in Europe, probably because some fans mistook the original design for a marijuana leaf. When Pikmin 1 and 2 were re-released on Wii years later, they were updated with new motion controls, graphical enhancements, and an improved save system. But according to Shigefumi Hino, the Pikmin team discussed adding even more enhancements. Additional enhancements could have made the re-releases into something like a Pikmin 1 and 2 Deluxe, but Hino said Nintendo later told the Pikmin team both games should be released on Wii as soon as possible, so updates and enhancements were kept to a minimum. When the original Pikmin was in development, Miyamoto told his team that the next Mario is Pikmin. But after the game's release, sales turned out to be a massive disappointment. It only managed to sell a little over 1 million copies, and Pikmin 2 sold even less than that. For comparison's sake, Mario Sunshine sold over 6 million copies, and even Wind Waker, which Nintendo considered a commercial failure, sold more than 3 million. As a result, Pikmin 3 ended up pretty low on Nintendo's list of priorities. Development on Pikmin 3 consisted of just 5 team members conducting experiments on various hardware, including on Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS. In a 2013 interview, he specifically mentioned a DS prototype that was never made public, although we do have some idea what Pikmin DS looked like because Nintendo filed a patent for it in 2005, about 3 years before Miyamoto announced a new Pikmin game was even in development. The patent shows the player controlling groups of Pikmin by circling them with the stylus, ordering them to kill enemies, and carrying their carcasses back to the onion. The patent also shows Pikmin carrying pellets and mentions picking flowers. In short, it depicts a handheld version of the traditional Pikmin experience. However, Miyamoto described it as a new type of Pikmin game, so it seems there was more to Pikmin DS than what's revealed in the patent. Unfortunately, it was never greenlit for full-scale production. Instead, the handheld Pikmin game fans ended up getting was Hey Pikmin, which didn't even manage to sell 500,000 copies and garnered an average review score of just 69%. After the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS testing, Miyamoto's team also experimented with Pikmin 3 on 3DS. Then for quite a while, they planned to release the game on Wii, but it wasn't until the Wii U came along that the small team was expanded to around 50 developers. According to Miyamoto, the Wii U's HD resolution was his inspiration to kick production into high gear, since it'd finally show each individual Pikmin with much greater detail. He also said Nintendo franchises like Zelda wouldn't have much to gain on a future 4K console, but 4K could be a huge benefit for the Pikmin series. The more clearly you can see each Pikmin, the more you care about them, and the more anguish you feel when your mistakes get them killed. During Pikmin 3's development, Miyamoto had the debuggers make sure the game could be completed without losing a single Pikmin. In his mind, Pikmin's sort of a mix between F-Zero and Saving Private Ryan, telling Japanese outlet 4Gamer that Pikmin can be more heartbreaking than a war movie. In Saving Private Ryan, a World War II general orders a team of soldiers to march across German-occupied France to save just one one man. Several of them die in the process, which Miyamoto likens to the player trekking across PNF 404 at sunset to save one lost Pikmin. Like the general in the film, it's up to the player to decide those types of ethical questions for themselves. Miyamoto also produced the F-Zero series and hopes fans will think of his racing games when they're playing Pikmin 3, competing for the highest scores and quickest times by replaying again and again, especially in mission mode. About 30% of the team's ideas didn't end up making it into the game, like online versus mode. Miyamoto said, "We gave up on that. We wanted to include it in Pikmin 3, but we would have had to make other sacrifices to include it. So we've decided to focus on the single-player and local multiplayer aspects, which are really fun. But unfortunately, no online multiplayer for Pikmin 3. A fourth playable character, codenamed D in concept art shown at E3 2012, was also scrapped. But even before D was created and cut, Miyamoto originally planned to include Olimar. He said, "Actually, when we showed Pikmin 3 at last year's E3, there were 4 captains. But when you have 4 playable characters, it becomes too complicated to switch between them. So in the end, we decided to reduce it to just 3 captains. Even though I made that decision myself, up until the middle of development, I still thought Olimar would be playable." Olimar wasn't a playable character in Pikmin 3 on Wii U, but he did make it back into the game 7 years later, along with Louie in Pikmin 3 Deluxe's side stories. But what about the question fans have been wondering for years? Where is Pikmin 4? When GameSpot asked Miyamoto in 2016, he told them, "When we're in development, we have to create a list of priorities, and it has been hard to kind of fit Pikmin 4 into that list." Then a year later, he told Eurogamer, "I've been told not to share anything about this from PR, but I can tell you it is progressing." After the disappointing sales of Pikmin 1 and 2, a third game was such a low priority, it took Nintendo almost a decade to finish. And just like its predecessors, the third game barely managed to sell 1 million copies. As a result, Pikmin 4 is probably still in its early days, the same way Pikmin 3 spent 5 years with a skeleton crew experimenting with different ideas. With any luck, future hardware with higher resolutions might reignite Miyamoto's enthusiasm, or outstanding sales of Pikmin 3 Deluxe could provide Nintendo justification to devote their resources. Failing those two possibilities, fans eagerly anticipating Pikmin 4 might be in store for another long winter ahead. Did you know that many collectible items in all 3 Pikmin games were altered to avoid controversy? For more Pikmin facts, check out the video on screen. Thank you for watching, and many thanks to DidYouKnowGaming for having me on again. I'm a very big Pikmin fan, and this was a really wonderful opportunity. If you want to hear me obsessively talk about the series, you can check out my channel at youtube.com/arlostuff. You all have a wonderful day. Goodbye.